Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Longtime listeners of the show will know that Sagar and I have spent a lot of time focusing on the story of China and Hollywood. What happens when an American industry, which is framed specifically around free speech, artistic expression, and American values, what happens when this industry has to enter the Chinese market in order to make money, yet at the same time is forced to jettison many of those same values? There's been plenty of controversies around this the past couple of years, with Mulan, Marvel movies getting banned from the country, all these recurring incidents. And at the center of this story has been Top Gun Maverick. The sequel to the original Top Gun was initially incredibly controversial because of the fact that the infamous leather jacket that Maverick wears on his motorcycle supposedly was going to have the Taiwanese flag removed from it due to an effort to get into the Chinese market. Secondly, the company Tencent Pictures was supposedly going to finance it. This is a Chinese company. These incredibly controversial moves really set Hollywood up for another big controversy. However, neither of these things ended up happening. And as of this week, Top Gun Maverick is nearing $1 billion in global box office without actually entering into the Chinese market. So this story has evolved so many different ways that I thought this would be the perfect time to update our coverage. I'm speaking with Chris Fenton. He's the author of Feeding the Dragon: Inside the $1 Trillion Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Business. He actually worked to finance and produce American films in China. He played a leading role in bringing Iron Man 3 to the country and really solidifying Marvel's really complicated relationship in the country. So there's a lot that we're going to hit here. It's great to get the chance to update these types of stories. So with all that said, before we jump in, I want to shout out our Supercast. Sagar and I dropped another exclusive subscriber conversation / question and answer session. If you'd like to get access to that full feed, or if you'd like to just check out what we're doing and support our work, you can go to realignment.supercast.com, or you could click the link in your show notes. Of course, we'd be remiss not to mention Lincoln Network Support for our work. Hope you enjoy this episode. Chris Fenton, welcome to the Realignment.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a real honor. I'm a huge fan of the show.
Yeah, and this is the perfect time to have this conversation. The conversation about China, Hollywood, the NBA, the tech industry. You could basically always have it, but I think with this month, everything from Top Gun Maverick doing incredibly well at the box office to Lightyear kind of struggling, but also having like the broader LGBTQ question, and then just the TikTok news this week means that we're going to hit everything we could possibly hit. Considering that range, then can you just give your background? Like, why are you the person that I think is probably the best one to hit this topic?
Yeah, it's actually a great question. I sometimes ponder it myself. I mean, I consider myself a bit of a layman's expert in the US-China exchange, mainly because I never really expected to be in the middle of two superpowers doing cultural and commercial exchange. I just sort of fell into it. My background is grew up in the East Coast and went to college up at Cornell University, got an engineering degree. And when I graduated in '93, the economy was not all that good. So I actually had the opportunity to travel the country. I did that for about a year. And then I ended up in Los Angeles just visiting some friends. And it was 72 and sunny every day. And they had this business called Hollywood, which they were essentially calling or nicknaming Hollywood or Wall Street of the '90s. And I ended up settling down, got a job waiting tables at the Olive Garden while I was doing some interviews around town. Eventually got into the mailroom of an agency called the William Morris Agency, which is and no longer exists, but at the time it was the largest agency in the world. It had been around for over 100 years. And I went into that sort of wax on, wax off process of learning the Hollywood business, essentially the business behind the business behind directors, writers, actors, producers, how that all got put together. And while I was there for a decade, I came across a small commercial production house that was based in China that was actually financing small independent films. One of them grabbed my attention and I started working with them. And over time, I realized, wow, there's a huge business to be had in China. So I went over there and visited, and then I had an opportunity to work for them a bit while I started my own company. And that started to gobble up more and more of my time. And then eventually they bought it. So when I started working with them, it was a company probably worth roughly $50 million privately. We ended up going public on the Shenzhen exchange. At one time, we were worth about 8 billion US in market cap. So it was quite a roller coaster ride. And through that 20 years of working with them and being the bridge essentially between the US and China and creating business opportunities, I learned a lot of the layman errors and where the gravy was and where the successes could be and where the failures lie, between these two superpowers that, quite frankly, really need each other, but also don't necessarily get along very well. And as we can see right now, are truly rivals on a global stage.
I want to start with some background questions given what you just said. So, number one, I'm interested in your use of the words economic and cultural exchange between the United States and China, because let's go back to the 80s for a second. I wasn't alive, but you've read things and you could just consume this. You obviously have the fact that Japan was an economic rival to the United States. We would buy things there, they would buy things here. Toyota comes in. So that's the economic side. But at the same time, you have a cultural exchange in the sense of like anime is getting bigger, manga exists. You have like the Nintendo, Mario comes over to the United States. What is the Chinese equivalent of Chinese culture coming to the United States during this relationship? Because I'm not really seeing anything come to mind immediately.
Well, first of all, I mean, I consider myself a sort of layman's expert in cultural and commercial exchange, because I do think there are a lot of people that maybe are experts in the cultural exchange area or maybe the commercial exchange area, but I sort of blended the two. And what's really interesting about culture is it's much different than just commercial exchange. Commercial exchange is just transactional. There's not an emotional human touch point between it. So when you combine it with things like movies, television, sports, you actually create this bond, this glue between two very separate cultures because of the human element that's involved with creating the commerce around whatever cultural content you're creating, whether that's sports or music or business, et cetera. So it's way different than the relationship, say, for instance, that we have with Saudi Arabia, which is over essentially oil or military hardware, et cetera. When it comes to China, there is that real sort of touch point, that glue. And what's interesting about it is that a lot of us, and by the way, I was just one of the cogs in the wheel, there were plenty of us, we really believed in that cultural and commercial exchange power to actually bridge these countries together and actually spread the aspirational quality of democracy inside a communist country. So it was much bigger than the actual transactions that we were doing on a daily basis. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I had a great career in 20 years. It was very successful financially. But on top of it, what really drove me was that ability to possibly make a better world. And then, of course, over time, like watching the movie The Sixth Sense, you realize that Bruce Willis was dead at the very end, right? And you're like, wait, why didn't I know that during the whole movie? Well, in this particular case, everybody involved with the exchange of commerce and culture, and any other interaction with China, with the US, is aware of the long-term detrimental effects to our long-term health as a democracy and as the West. So in going towards what we see with cultural spread from China outwards, we're actually seeing a lot of forced spread where, for instance, China is really trying to promote its narrative in various content and culture that they have through very sort of strong-armed opportunities. Like, for instance, Dalai Wanda bought AMC theaters and Carmike theaters and became the largest theatrical exhibitor in the United States of America. That was a leverage play where the Chinese government thought that they could get a lot of their culture and content inside those theaters for Americans to digest. Now, obviously that didn't work, but that was part of their thought process. Now, if you look back towards some of the other stuff, you see it with, Eastern or alternative medicine. You see it in the martial arts space. You see it in various parts of different cultural fabrics that disseminate around the world, but it's not very plentiful. And then on top of it, a lot of the culture that they have created over there has been part of the imitation process. So, for instance, in the early 2000s, I went over there trying to scout good IP, intellectual property, from game and comic book stores. But what I saw back then happened to be a lot of Japanese manga or things that were ripped off from Korea, et cetera, or things that were purely copied in Chinese form from other countries around the world. So you didn't see a lot of originality in that. Cut to today, you're starting to see that growth, although she is definitely stifling it right now.
That's really interesting. And then the second part for your background before we get to Top Gun, you referred to Hollywood in the 90s as like the Wall Street of that decade. I'd love for you to go into that for a second because, you had all the blockbusters, you had all of that going on, but just looking at Hollywood today, it seems hard to imagine that world. So just talk about that.
Well, you had something that was a little reminiscent of what we had today prior to, say, Netflix earnings about a month and a half ago. Which was the proliferation of cable television, which allowed for a lot more content on the television stage to be created. And then on top of it, you had home entertainment, which was really creating a gravy train for the movie business. So there wasn't a lot of, say, oversight or concern about the P&Ls of making content because there was plenty of revenue to be derived, whether it was on the television side of things, or from the movie side of things through home entertainment. Then that also was combined with the fact that the movie market internationally started to grow. And that also dragged along with it television content. And if you looked at the content that was created at a premium level, almost all of it was coming from Hollywood in the United States of America. You didn't have shows like FADA or some of the other things coming from other markets around the world. It was all coming from Hollywood. So there was a huge piece of gravy to gain from international marketplace. Like when I first got in the business in the early 90s, you were talking maybe 20 to 25% of a movie's financial rewards were gained from the international marketplace. Cut to today, it's roughly 75%. So it's completely flipped.
So then that gets us to your actual book then. So a few years ago, you wrote this book. It's called Feeding the Dragon, Inside the $1 Trillion Dilemma Facing Hollywood, the NBA, and American Business. I really, listeners, cannot recommend it enough. People told me to stop breaking the fourth wall as much, but I will break it for this one. Summarize though, like what is the dilemma facing these industries?
Well, it's interesting. Simon and Schuster approached me about writing a book about like the top 10 things to do when you're doing business with China. And for me, coming from a storytelling space of Hollywood, that wasn't that exciting to me. And quite frankly, there's a lot of better experts out there for that than me. So I said, I'd like to write sort of a Michael Lewis type of almost autobiography like he did with Liar's Poker and really open up about like a lot of the pitfalls and failures I had, but also a lot of the successes. And they said, great. So that's what I put together. But what was interesting is as I was writing it, I went on a US congressional delegation trip to China with Reps Kirkpatrick from Arizona, Dina Titus from Utah, or from Nevada, and Alan Lowenthal from California. And I was there in later 2019, just prior to COVID. And we actually got down to Hong Kong and we met with Carrie Lam, and we also met with protesters. And I also smelled pepper spray for the first time. And I saw Free Hong Kongs graffitied all over the country. And then we also went through Beijing and we heard essentially Beijing's side of the story. And what was interesting is it started to open up to me a little bit more than where I was the previous 20 years on what was sort of going on over there that might be a little nefarious in terms of the way I believed the Chinese Communist Party was operating. Then on top of it, I come home and I'm on the sideline of a soccer game, and somebody forwards me a tweet from a guy named Daryl Morey, who I later found out was the GM of the Houston Rockets, that said, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And when I found out he was with the Rockets, I go to the father next to me. I said, "Oh my God, the NBA is going to have a huge problem in China from that tweet." And he's like, "Well, why is that? He's not even in China. He tweeted that from Japan or whatever." I was like, because the Houston Rockets are the biggest branded sports team in the country, thanks to Yao Ming. And on top of it, the Hong Kong situation is very clear to the Chinese Communist Party that that is their territory and they are just taking it back. Now, Granted, it was 27 years earlier than they promised, but they felt like they had every right to do that. So if you look at that moment, that was the time where I suddenly was punched in the nose, like all of us, thinking, oh my God, like we're doing a lot of stuff that's not in the best interest of democracy around the world. And with that, we saw the dilemma. We saw the dilemma pop up on an hourly basis between critics and politicians and journalists in terms of how the NBA was trying to navigate that geopolitical controversy. They could not come up with a good message at all. They were trying to put their foot in two separate boats that were separating, and they fell directly into the water. The dilemma there is, how do you protect the values, principles, human rights issues, the things that we value as a democracy, the things we value as the kind of capitalism that we want the world to have, versus opening up more and more the China market to your product and service? That is the dilemma. And in order to open that market, you really have to suppress the beliefs and the values you have in order to play into what the Chinese Communist Party is asking you to do. And that's the dilemma that we started to see happen even back to Tiananmen Square in 1989. You started to see businesses go, ooh, geez, what do we do at this moment? And that was a crucial moment where literally every industry and business said, you know what, we're going to look past that. We're going to pretend it didn't happen, and we're going to move forward. But at this point in time, we're starting to see companies rethink that. And that's where it gets into the Top Gun discussion and various others that we can cover.
Yeah. And two questions before we get into that specific example. I'm curious, would you categorize the NBA, American business, and Hollywood's entry into the Chinese market as driven by greed or by necessity? What I mean by that is, it's easy just to say, oh, these companies, these industries, they're desperate for money. They just want more, more, more. Chris wants his third home. He needs that, extra pool or something like that. Or, hey, it's Hollywood. Netflix is on the rise. You have theaters that are basically falling apart because of the COVID pandemic. We literally need to get into these foreign markets, not merely because we want to make money, but because our industry will be severely harmed without it. To what degree is it a mix of greed, but also necessity?
Well, it's a great question. And I'll say that there are definitely greedy corporate capitalists out there willing to sell the soul of America to make a buck. There are some. I would argue it's very few. It's a minority. I mean, all of us have consciences. And when we're aware that we're doing something wrong, I think that conscience inside of us really starts to permeate and start to move you towards the right direction, no matter how much money is at stake. Now, we see plenty of exceptions to that. And I myself, I've been torn over that myself. But I think that's a rare, rare, rare bird. Okay. Most of us actually saw an opportunity to make money. And most of us believed in going back to Kissinger and Nixon when they visited the ground in 1972. And when we opened up China to trade the WTO in 1979, we believed that the more commerce we got going with that country, the safer the world would be, the more we could permeate the, essentially the aspirational quality of democracy inside a communist country, and the more we would win them over and they'd become more like us. Like, it was never about, oh, let's just see how much money we can make, move on to the next thing, right? Like, there was a bigger driver for a lot of us. But over time, I would say 100% of us have been socked in the nose about how this is not good. The status quo is not good. And I'd argue almost all of us don't want war or a Cold War with the other superpower, but almost all of us think that the status quo cannot continue. It's going to be really terrible and detrimental to the long-term health of the West. Okay. But there's still some that are continuing to toe the party line of China. And I think they are still they're thinking about how they deal with this. And we know the ones we watch CNBC, and it's very frustrating to see people toe that line. But remember, a lot of them have LPs, they have investors, they have shareholders, they have fiduciary responsibilities that they have to uphold. And if they don't, it becomes a game of whack-a-mole. They get replaced and and the new person that comes in toes the Chinese party line. Like there's no way that you can separately as an individual take on the problem and not simply be replaced. It's got to be a unified front. It's got to be both left and right, red and blue, and everything other color in between. This has got to be something where we're united. We stand not just with us, but with other allies. And the fact of the matter is China, and you see it even in the micro deal making aspects, they're a bit like a teenager. Like if you push back because they broke curfew, they don't break curfew again. But if you allow them the leniency to break curfew, they will push curfew back farther and farther and farther. And we've seen that in various ways that they have encroached. In fact, one of the ones I called out 2 years ago was Tesla. I said, Tesla is going to get decimated in China. They're going to lose all their IP. They're going to be shut out of the market, and various other things are going to happen to them. That is just the same model that we've seen with every other industry and business there. And we're starting to see it even with Tesla, even with the leverage that Elon Musk has. Xi Jinping's on vacation for 2 months in the northern region of China. And there's reports that no Teslas are allowed anywhere near his eyesight, anywhere near his eye line. So we're starting to see even the greatest US companies and greatest entrepreneurs run into the same problems that so many other of us have had.
So let's actually get to the clickbait and get to Top Gun Maverick, which I loved, by the way. I'm curious. I'm sure you watched it.
Okay. My wife hates when I watch movies because I analyze them from a very structural standpoint. I will say that Top Gun to me started off like a movie that was resting on the nostalgia effect. And I was sort of unclear with the first act, whether I was going to fall in love with it or whether it was overhyped. But I will tell you the low point of the movie really delivered, which for people that study 3-act structures, that's the end of the second act. And what is the journey of that protagonist moving forward in the third act? If you want to know where that low point was, it was where Tom Cruise is essentially fired from, handling this new crop of fighter pilots. And his wife says, you know what, you never sort of gave up. She's his Yoda. He gets inspired. He flies in, unannounced in that one training session. Everybody rah-rahs around him. He's so good, he doesn't get fired. And boom, you're off on the third act. That to me delivered on every level. And that third act, which I thought ended a couple different times, kept delivering more and more. So I'm a believer in that movie. I loved it. Okay. What's even better is probably what you want to ask me about.
Well, and one quick thing though, to add to your point though, to turn this into a film reviewing show for a second, what I loved about that low point is that even when he got out of it, we're obviously hitting spoilers, people. It's been almost a month. I hope you've seen it by now. He's done after this, no matter what happens. Like, that's the key thing. Like, even though they give him the mission, the still brought, and this is what makes it not like a cheesy after school special. It's not like, whoa, Tom Cruise, you really showed us like you are going to become an admiral despite not getting promoted for 15 years. No, like he still has the opportunity to make that low point mean something moving forward. And that just really, I really appreciated that. But no, so here's the next question then that you were anticipating. The next question is, what is the significance of Top Gun Maverick's success to the story we've just told? Because frankly, listeners who've been following this topic will know that the narrative around this movie being like a repudiation of entanglement with China is the opposite of what we thought it was going to be. So if we'd had you on in 2019 when your book came out, the show was too new, so we hadn't even heard, like, interacted with your work yet. But we would have said, man, it's crazy. Top Gun Maverick 2, it's financed by Tencent, a Chinese company. They removed the Taiwanese flag from his like infamous like leather jacket. This is crazy. Like, what's happening here? Now the narrative's totally different. So what happened over the past 3 years to get us here?
Well, it's really interesting. And then you go back even to 2014 when that one Transformers movie was made, where it takes place in Hong Kong, and to save the day from the Transformers, the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army from China, comes into the rescue before the United States can. And there's so much symbolism over that 2014 movie and sort of what happened to Hong Kong in 2019. It's unbelievably eerie to me. But if you look at what happened in the US-China exchange is that I think Daryl Morey really opened everybody's eyes to this over-pandering that was occurring. You started to have the populist critics, politicians, journalists see what was going on, and they started to really scrutinize the way companies were behaving when it came to China. Now, that didn't curb what was happening with these companies in China. I mean, they still need to create revenue and drive profits, and that market is growing, et cetera, et cetera. But every time they did something, it was put out into the ether that they did it, right? Like in Mulan, which was a Disney movie, they thanked Xinjiang officials for the ability to shoot some of the movie there. Xinjiang officials are obviously involved with what's going on with the Uyghur controversy. Washington Post first reported that. Next thing you know, huge geopolitical issue for Disney. And not only that, China clamps down on Mulan making any money in China because of that geopolitical issue. And then you started to see Disney not even get their Marvel movies in or other Disney movies in as a result of that. Then you combine that with the fact that COVID came along and really screwed up a lot of what was considered status quo around the world anyway when it came to industries. And you also had the China market start to shut down and open back up. And as that happened, we started to also see Xi Jinping start to turn the country inwards, right? They started to realize, hey, all these companies that were getting access to our market were getting access to our consumers to sell them fish. But in that process, we ordered them in order to have that opportunity. They had to teach us how to fish, right? And as we taught them how to fish, they grew their own industries inside of China to compete with the industries outside of China. And by the way, I talk about this in my book. They just used the US model. We did this with what we called infant industries in the early 1800s when we were trying to catch our economy and our ability to make great best-in-class products and services with Europe. We put up all kinds of protectionist policies, tariffs, and we stole the heck out of IP and tech from Europe in order to catch up to them. And we did that really well. China used that same playbook on us, okay? So we started to see our movies do less and less money in that market, not just from COVID, but because of their turning inwards and the fact that Xi Jinping sees anything that comes out of Hollywood as propaganda from the West. So he's always trying to control messaging and narrative. So he doesn't really want our stuff in there. He just needed it for, say a decade and a half. Now that he doesn't need it, we're starting to see the risk reward calculus of making money in that market, at least on the movie front, not really worth it. So what I love is leading up to Top Gun, we saw a couple stand downs with the Chinese government when it came to Hollywood. And it's super, super inspiring in ways because there's been a lot of depressing parts about it too. But the first one was Sony. Sony made a movie, the last Spider-Man movie called Spider-Man Homecoming. They were pressed by the Chinese government. In order to get access to that market, they needed to cut out the Statue of Liberty from the third act of the movie. Now, if you've seen that movie, you realize that's almost the whole third act. And Sony stood up and said, no way. China said, you're not allowed in. What happened? The movie made $1 billion without China.
And to be precise real quick, you mean I'm a huge Marvel fan, so I'll nerd out. No, this was No Way Home.
No Way
Homecoming,
Home. Exactly.
Yeah, No Way.
Yes.
Yeah, so
No
very specific. So this is the most recent one that came out in December of 2021.
Yeah, I'm showing my age that I can't keep up with all the
or the fact that you have, or that you have a life. There's also that too.
So the second one was really interesting because I was involved with this company as we were trying to build the IP awareness and brand in China, which is Marvel. Marvel was having a real problem getting their movies into China, and they were getting pretty ticked off about it, right? They made Shang-Chi, which was essentially something that had relevancy to China inherently in it. And China said, you're not getting that movie in. Then they made Eternals with one of the great Chinese filmmakers who happens to still live in the US, but she's a Chinese filmmaker, Chloe Zhao. Eternals was not allowed in the market. So what's fascinating, I don't know exactly how it went down, but in the latest Doctor Strange movie, they actually have in two separate scenes of an action clip, they have the newsstand of the Falun Gong's Epic Times in there. Now, a lot of people don't know what the Epic Times is, but it's a pretty standout newsstand. It's a yellow newsstand or whatever. And when you shoot a Marvel movie, you have hundreds of people on set. So out of those hundreds of people, somebody's going to notice that it's there, but no one did anything about it. Then when you go into post-production, I would say more than 1,000 people look at every single frame of that movie because of all the VFX work, all the editing, all that kind of stuff. And no one said a word. So in the final cut of that movie, the Epic Times is in there. And of course, Chinese government saw it and said, no way is this getting into our market. So then Marvel essentially sets the trend on top of what Spider-Man did by essentially giving a bit of a throwback or a pushback to the Chinese government. I find it very hard to believe that that was just a mistake. So
and
then
could
that
you explain
leads,
what the Epic Times is for folks? Why is that such a, why is that the publication you'd feature if you were going to give that pushback?
well, the Falun Gong, and there's controversy around the Epic Times because it has gone pretty right leaning, although I think they actually do some pretty good reporting, but they do have that taint of being, pro one side of the aisle versus another. So there's a lot of people in Hollywood that probably don't pay attention to it, but it's the foundation of how it came about was from the Falun Gong, which is a ethnicity or a religious minority that has been persecuted over the years in China. And they essentially created what they call like a truthful news source. And you probably see these newsstands in most major cities. And then every once in a while, I think most of us end up getting a free paper in our driveway every once in a while. But it's something that a lot of people are aware about, and they do good journalism. That was something, the Falun Gong is something that's a complete thorn in the side of Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. So anything affiliated with that minority is going to get huge punishment. And in terms of a movie, they're just simply never going to get that movie in. And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if Marvel is blackballed from that market for many years to come.
And the real thing that we're talking about here when we say Marvel, given Bob Iger's acquisition moves when he was CEO of Disney, we mean Disney. So that's not just impacting Marvel, I'm sure that's impacting this whole broader set here.
And by the way, it's important to know that Marvel, so we made Iron Man 3, right? Because Disney and Ike Perlmutter, who was the biggest shareholder, said we need help building the brand and awareness in China. The largest movie we had prior to us committing to doing that was Iron Man 2. It made $20 million. We made Iron Man 3 as a collaboration between the US and China. It made $20 million in China the very first day. Okay. That broke the ground for Marvel to build its brand into the most valuable brand on earth in that market. And the proof of that was the last Avengers movie prior to all this geopolitical controversy. That last Avengers movie made $750 million just in China.
So something I'm a bit curious about is the Top Gun side. So it was initially reported that Tencent was going to finance this movie, once again, that Chinese company. And then B, like I said at the start of this, that you would actually have the Taiwanese flag removed from Maverick's jacket. Neither thing ended up happening. So I'm just curious for your analysis on how it all played out, because I think what I'm wondering is we could say this is all very, very positive in terms of everything changing, but Top Gun was originally supposed to come out in 2019 before they did. And this is pre-COVID. They added to very much to the film's credit, they added to the aerial combat scene. So then they pushed it back to 2020. And then obviously COVID happens, so they had to push back another 2 years. So if the movie had come out in May 2020, almost certainly, I guess we can't actually say this or not, but it seems as if there would have been a higher chance of Tencent still co-financing it and of that Taiwanese flag still being censored. I'm curious how you think like that plays out.
Well, look, I mean, we're speculating as Monday morning quarterbacks, but I would be at 99% confident that had the movie been released originally during its original release, and we didn't have COVID and some of the other stuff that sort of fouled up the theatrical system, it would 100% not had the Taiwanese flag. I mean, well, I'm not going to say 100%, 99% wouldn't
99.
have had the time. Now, keep in mind, like, because that was just around, I can't remember the original date. If it was May 2020, maybe they would have still had remnants of the Daryl Morey NBA issue to deal with, and journalists and politicians may have made that a major problem for Tom Cruise and Top Gun. But let's assume that the release date wasn't that affected by that. I think they
Mhm.
would have moved forward and tried to make as much money as possible from that market, assuming it wouldn't have created a geopolitical controversy that would have affected the West and other markets around the world. But when it did actually release, that was a whole different story.
So here's a question, and this is once again, like you're a person who's very much in the room in this sort of conversation. So I'm more curious what you think is going on at a psychological level relative to this is literally what we know is happening within the CCP. I've really appreciated how during this episode you articulated what the dilemma is. And this also comes through in the book. It seems, though, that at every single possible fork in the road, the CCP has worked to basically put the dilemma aside, which from your telling in the book or Eric Schwartzel's work, we had him on the show, that dilemma usually rebounded to to the Chinese government's interest, in the sense that the biggest industries in the world for America, in terms of from a soft power perspective, they self-censored themselves. They rewrote whole scripts to accommodate this very opaque, very unclear process. Yet, when you don't let any Marvel film in, when you don't throw a bone on Mulan, when you don't, let's say you put aside, let's put aside Doctor Strange because the Epic Times is clearly going to be aligned too far, but just let the Statue of Liberty thing happen. That's easily worth the price by just basically making it so that this is no longer so that basically if you're that, let's say, top 1% greedy American capitalist who's just going to barrel through and like make money and also subvert values, you have nowhere left to stand given the decisions the CCP has made the past 2 years. So what do you think is going on? Because it genuinely doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm not on the standing committee, nor am I Xi Jinping. So I'm just going to speculate a little bit here based on some of the stuff I picked up over the years. But the number one goal, when I talk about it in the book, of the Chinese Communist Party in the most macro sense, as somebody not Chinese, and the way I have to think about it and then work my way down in regards to more micro decision making, is that they got to keep 1.4 billion people just happy enough that they don't revolt. And the reason I say just happy enough is because there's not enough resources on earth to make them all happy. They can't have all of what they want. We make the world Swiss cheese. So they got to create this idea that that everyone has all of what they need, some of what they want, and they have this ability to move upwards to get more of what they want. And a lot of that is in narrative. So if you're looking at what the movie business represented to the Chinese government, I don't really think they thought too far. Well, they think on 100-year horizons, but I think the number one reason they needed us to begin with was they wanted to create their own ability to create global best in class soft power, which is movies, right? Not only to essentially placate their own people, but also someday to spread out around the world. That's a huge, huge ability to get your narrative out there. Top Gun's a perfect example of it, coming from Hollywood going the other direction, right? Number two is they were creating a middle class. They were building the economy. Real estate was a big part of it. So in the center of some of the biggest real estate developments throughout the first, second, and third tier cities were multiplexes or theme parks based on IP that were, partially derived from Hollywood or promoted by Hollywood, and you see obviously Disney has a theme park, Universal has a theme park. And by the way, Universal's Beijing theme park has massive real estate interests around it. So they needed to make sure they could fill seats and make those cinemaplexes big, attractive areas that were working. So Hollywood satisfied that. So we did two things. One was sort of help propel their building of the economy. Number two is we started to create their own industry, which obviously created new middle class jobs and the ability to move upward, as far as if you were somebody that was in the lower class and wanted to move up in the middle class. So we did a lot of great things for the CCP's objective. Now that that's been accomplished, and by the way, keep in mind, Universal's theme park is 70% owned by China, and even Disney's is 57% owned. Now they don't need us there. So I think there's probably some mistakes along the way where they use so much leverage that now they're clouding our ability to go, is it worth doing what we need to do to get our products and services into China? And maybe they've made some missteps in terms of us going, well, wait a minute, maybe we can get in there. So let's keep pandering to them and putting in the messaging that they want. But they've taken such an ironclad take on it that I would argue that maybe you're right. Maybe they actually overstepped, and we're starting to see the adult in the room push the teenager backwards because they've gone too far. Right now, Hollywood's one example where they may have, but there's other industries where they haven't. And we're seeing a lot of push, for instance, Wall Street, of continuing to try to get our capital markets more and more open to what they do. And that's because the risk reward calculation is much clearer for the CEOs and the executives making those decisions. But in Hollywood, it's way more cloudy. And whether they intentionally meant to overstep or not, I don't know, but you might be right. They might have overplayed their hand.
Yeah, but given what you just said, that was a really great answer because it helped me think about what I just said in a slightly different manner. My question and skepticism was framed around this idea that their number one objective was exploiting the $1 trillion dilemma, to quote you. Your point, I think what comes here is that there are competing things that have to be valued. So yes, I'm sure you could maximize US cultural economic pain and conflict and difficulty, soft power leveraging, et cetera. But there are clearly other metrics that are being judged. So maybe it's a little unfair to say, putting morality aside, that the policy is a bad policy, because all policy is about competing and balancing different factors. So
by the way, just really quick, one place where they could come back and compromise with Hollywood, and I think it would be, if there's such a thing as a tolerable form of pandering, I think they could get away with it. If they went to Tom Cruise and Paramount and said, and by the way, keep in mind, Top Gun isn't really the kind of movie Xi Jinping wants in that market anyway. So it's like a little bit of a apples and oranges comparison. But assume it's like just a completely neutral big franchise, right? Fast and the Furious.
Mm-hmm.
They could have come and said, hey, in our market, take the Taiwanese flag off of that jacket. And Hollywood may, like we do with lots of other markets where we actually censor for a specific market. You know, there's Japan, they don't want to see pubic hair. You know, Middle East, they don't want to see, you know, kissing or whatever it is. Like, you take that out for the market, but the rest of the world sees what the filmmakers want the rest of the world to see. The problem with China is they've encroached on Hollywood's ability to have freedom of creativity, free speech, in order to spread their narrative around the world. They are telling us that Taiwanese flag cannot be seen anywhere in the world. And that's a problem. And we are pre-censoring ourselves, premeditated censorship on even pitches, ideas, scripts, based on what we think we can't make because they're going to be upset about it in China, which is affecting what the rest of the world can see, which is coming from Hollywood, including, like, for instance, a documentary, Gabe Polsky and Alex Gibney, who's an Oscar-winning documentarian. They have the rights to my book to make into a documentary. And there are various platforms and studios who won't even hear the pitch from one of the best teams in the business when it comes to documentaries, because they're afraid of what China will think of it.
I'm glad you added the word / phrase premeditated, though, because once again, having read your book, I know that one of the biggest difficulties of this situation is that it's not as if this isn't like with Saudi Arabia and many of like the governmental like vice departments across like the rest of Asia, where there's this explicit, you cannot do X, Y, or Z process. When it comes to the way the CCP approves movies, though, and you know, you write this once again, it's actually kind of opaque. So how would they even offer the compromise deal you're describing here? Because what makes this so difficult to actually navigate is the fact that, well, what would happen if we included this bit? Or, would this affect this? Maybe they let this through, but then next year they let fewer of our movies through in the first place. Or what happens if they let in one of our weaker movies that then therefore underperforms? So it seems to me that there's no way that deal could actually be offered given the actual structure that's been set up, which is no one actually knows and it's pure guesswork. So would that broad structure have to change? And actually, and by the way, if it then became that explicit, that'd probably even put Hollywood in even a worse stage. So now it's one thing to say, like, okay, well, I know there's like a gay scene in this movie. Let's just like not talk about it or even write it on the page. Then you're Disney. Then you're having to explicitly say, no, like we traded away a lesbian kiss so that we could make X amount of money. From a PR perspective, that seems even worse. So like, I get your point about this being a compromise deal, but I would not take this compromise deal, even if it were on the table. But this is actually what you did for a living. So like, how would you personally like navigate like the idea of like, are we trading away censorship in a specific market for more money?
Well, we 100% are and have, but we're slightly moving towards the better side of that very slowly. But I will say one of the great strategic plays. Now, keep in mind, the art of war is something that the Chinese know really well, right? Like they know how to separate people so that they can't unify and actually push back, right? We talked about like one CEO, taking a stand while they just get replaced. The other thing is they're really good at ambiguity, right? I sort of compare it to like leaning back in a bar stool and just about to fall, but you don't. And it's like sort of the way you always are feeling when it comes to China. And they love that. They love the fact that no one knows exactly why their movie didn't get in, why their product or service didn't get traction there, why it got rejected, whatever it is, right? No one knows exactly sure. They're just not sure. And because of that, you're not focused on like, okay, we can't do this, we can't do that, we can't do that. Instead, that ambiguity creates this much wider net of stuff that you're avoiding because you're just not simply sure whether that's the thing that ticks them off. And that is a beautiful leverage strategy that they use against us. And it's something that is really hard to push back on unless we start to think about capitalism and doing the right thing coexisting. And I'll bring it to the WTA, Women's Tennis Association. I don't think they really wanted to take a stand. I don't think anybody that's making money in China necessarily wants to be Mother Teresa and be like, I'm going to do the right thing. But what was beautiful about the disappearance of Peng Shui, which I think you guys have spoken about quite a bit on this show. She's a women's tennis player in China. She took a stand against a very senior Chinese Communist Party official for harassment, sexual abuse, etc. And she essentially was disappeared, a la Jack Ma, but worse. She's made certain appearances where she looks like a robot and is being told what to do. But women tennis players around the world took a stand and said, we are not going to be okay with this. We refuse to play in that country. We refuse to, surrender to the human rights things that we support as individuals. And you need to fix this, China, right? And there were enough of them and enough of other people that came out where the Women's Tennis Association, an association I never really thought too much about, had to take the stand with them. And what happened? China said, well, you're out. You're done. You're not having your events here. Your sponsors are going away, et cetera. And the Women's Tennis Association, which was unknown to many of us, or just not thought about to many of us, suddenly propelled their brand 5x from what it was prior to that. And what happened is that stand that they took, that business they lost in China, was replaced elsewhere around the world with new events and new partners, new sponsors, et cetera. And they now, I think, I call it the Muhammad Ali effect. They took a short-term hit to stand for something that's right, and now their brand is worth a lot more. And I would argue that somebody like LeBron James, and maybe Tom Cruise has just done it himself, because no one does anything on a Tom Cruise movie if Tom Cruise doesn't approve it, right? So he was probably behind this idea of taking the flag and putting it back on. But LeBron James could probably do the same thing. I think he could take a stand and say, I don't stand for what's happening in China. I'm going to lose my 50 million a year, or whatever it is over there. And people would be like, wow, you're bigger than the sport itself. You have taken on the Muhammad Ali effect. And instead of being worth $1 billion, you're going to be worth 3 billion. I think somebody like that could do that. I could argue that John Cena probably could have done that when the controversy came out about him recognizing Taiwan as a country. It is possible for capitalism and doing the right thing to coexist. And I think we're seeing proof of that. And we're going to start to see more important individuals or entities with that leverage take that stand.
Nearing the end here, a question I have is, a lot of headlines quoted you actually. A couple of stories, Bloomberg, other outlets discussing, does Top Gun's success mean that Hollywood no longer needs China? It's hit $900 million across the globe about that Chinese market. One of the themes of the movie, though, is clearly that Tom Cruise is this incredible, awesome 80s relic. And and he's the only person who could pull off the mission at the end. But despite all that, that's it. This is it for him. He's nearing 60, all that bit. That metaphor obviously applies to Top Gun as well, right? This is a movie from the 80s that was incredibly culturally relevant. If there was a brand or an IP that could definitely do $1 billion without China, it's Top Gun. It's the Tom Cruise vehicle. Are movies moving into the future going to have the capacity to pull off what Top Gun 2 has been able to pull off without the same A-list star tent poles, without the same 40 years of really strong, not mistreated IP? What do you think about that?
Well, will there always be a market for these well-crafted major productions of $200 million based on whatever IP or ideas? Yes, 100%. I really believe that strongly. In fact, I'm in the business. I'm involved in the business in many capacities. I'm involved on the investing side of the business. I think super premium content that Hollywood makes at a high quality level is always going to be well monetized. I would argue it's a quality over quantity thing, which I think the Netflix earnings 6 weeks or 7 weeks ago prove that. So we need to be smarter. But the way to monetize content has gotten way more efficient. You don't necessarily have to take a movie and release it theatrically to activate what they call the ultimate window of a particular movie, which is the 10-year first cycle distribution of that film. And that includes broadcast, that includes SVOD, AVOD, electronic stream through home entertainment, you name it. And that bases those particular distribution windows around the world in every market, right? Those markets around the world have gotten better and more efficient at releasing super premium content than ever before. The ability to collect that revenue has gotten more efficient and more streamlined, and also the percentages have gotten better. So even without China, we have an opportunity to really grow the business in a great way. China will always represent potential gravy for something, but it should only be seen as potential gravy. It should be seen that we are the bastions of creative expression, freedom of speech, and we protect filmmakers' rights to make what they want to make in the stories that they tell. And if something happens to sneak into China and make gravy, fantastic. But let's focus essentially our P&Ls, or our ability to say, okay, this is a smart budget to make this movie at because we project X, Y, and Z to make as our revenues. Let's just focus on making great movies and protecting those freedoms, because every once in a while we'll get one that gets the gravy in China. But on the interim, we're not going to be pandering to them, and we're going to be doing what we're supposed to be doing, and we're going to be generating revenue and profits that smart businesses do. And it's something I'm very hopeful about, because we actually really do have the way to make this business work without falling back into the Chinese Communist Party telling us what to do. Now, the one other thing I'll add is I don't want a Cold War or war. Like, the status quo cannot exist the way it is. but I also don't want a full decoupling from China either. That's only going to move us down a very dangerous path. What we need to do is right the playing field. We need to level it out. There's lots of simple things that we can do on a macro basis, like designate them as a developed nation rather than a developing nation by the WTO, put their SEC accounting standards on all of their companies trying to get access to our capital markets like they don't have right now. That's crazy. Like, let's level the playing field. Let's back them off on the things that they have encroached upon too much, and let's make it fair and balanced. And yes, there'll be growing pains to do that, but in the long run, it will be better for the West, and it will also keep the two superpowers that have lots of differences from going to war.
Mm-hmm. Very well said, Chris. This has been really, really great. Do you have a lot of folks like this topic? We obviously did the red carpet episode of Eric Schwartzel a few months ago, but do you have any just like resources or recommendations for folks who, or even like good books about Hollywood? Because I think this is one of my favorite realignment topics, because there's clearly a upheaval in the industry and a lot of things that are going to come next are at the very like nascent stages right now.
Well, I think a fascinating book that I read when I first got in the business, I think is still pretty timely today, is it was about the movie The Bonfire of the Vanities, which was a huge bomb in the 80s. It starred Tom Hanks. The book is called The Devil's Candy. It's fantastic. It talks about the excesses of how movies are made and all the issues, and it's got great drama and color, and I highly recommend that one. I'd also always recommend, by the way, Eric Schwartzel is fantastic. He's a friend. He's been covering this since I think 2016. I've been involved with a lot of his articles over the years. Love him. If you haven't read Red Carpet, definitely read it. I would also say that Josh Rogan did, I think, one of the greatest jobs of talking about the insider conversations and dilemmas when it comes to presidents dealing with China and God, why am I? Oh, Chaos Under Heaven. Josh Rogan, Washington Post, Chaos Under Heaven. Absolutely fantastic read about the Trump administration and how they were dealing with China. And it really opened our eyes, because whether you like Donald Trump or not, doesn't matter. What he did do, though, is he was like the junior high schooler who pulled the fire alarm in the middle of school, and everybody ran out knowing that there was a problem, right? We have a problem with China. We need to figure out how to deal with it and address it together. That's both red and blue. But those two books I absolutely love. And then if anybody really wants to dig in quite a bit deeper into understanding on a daily basis what's happening in China, I highly recommend Sinocism, which is a newsletter that Bill Bishop puts out on a daily basis. It's a 10 out of 10.
Excellent. Chris, thank you for joining us on the Realignment.
Yeah, and please follow me at the Dragon Feeder and give me any criticism you want, because I'm working on the second book, and always very open to trying to figure out how to talk about China in a better way that really approaches people, because this is something that affects all of us. And it's something we all need to find solutions to. I mean, this is a really big issue for the next century. And as somebody with two 15-year-old kids, I really want to find a way to solve the problem and move us forward in the right way, because I don't want them dealing with some sort of a Cold War as they grow up.